Have you ever watched Adventure Time and thought that Finn in the title card for Angel Face looks like Clint Eastwood in The Outlaw Josie Wales? Or ever wondered why the font and character silhouettes in the title card for Web Weirdos looks like the poster for Alfred Hitchcock's Vertigo? Or ever noticed the similarities between the title card for The Pods and the one sheet for Alien? If so, then you've come to the right place. My name is Jacob Daniel Barnes, this is Filmthetics, and today we're going to be taking a look at the graphic design, and in particular the movie posters that inspired the Adventure Time title cards. The title card for Season 4's Web Weirdos is directly inspired by the work of prolific artist and poster designer Saul, and arguably the most venerated poster of all time, his work for the 1958 Hitchcock film, Vertigo. Notice the similarities between the two, the hand-drawn type, the character silhouettes, the world fragmenting around them. What makes the poster for Vertigo and the title card for Web Weirdos so effective and alluring is the duality it creates through its negative space. This isn't a perfect comparison, but a comparison can be made between what's happening here and the ambiguous image, a visual illusion in which a single image can be perceived in more than one way. Maybe the most recognizable example of this is the duck-rabbit illusion. Focus on the front half of the image and it looks like a duck. Focus on the back half and it looks like a rabbit. Or, for instance, Rubens' vase. Focus on the light space and it's two faces. Focus on the dark space and it's the vase. In all of these situations, there are two options, and whether you see one option over the other, neither are incorrect. The same applies to the characters on the Vertigo poster. Are they spiraling chaotically out of control, or harmoniously synchronized in a calculated dance? In the same way, are Finn and Jake falling through a world shattering around them, or are they stuck in a world in which they cannot escape? I think the titles of both pieces suggest one opinion over the other, but who's to say an argument can't be made for either? And who's to say it couldn't be both? Herein lies the genius of these graphic designs. The answer is solely up to you. It's the empty space that allows the audience to become the artist. In that moment, the viewer absorbs the responsibility of writer or director or actor and mends the gaps creatively to decide for themselves what it all means. In that way, these works transcend the plane of mere interpretation and evolve into active participation. And in my opinion, no body of work within movie poster design showcases such consistent strokes of brilliance quite like that of Saul Bass. Not only purely from an aesthetic standpoint, but also from a marketing standpoint. Because at the end of the day, who wouldn't pay money to watch a film that they were given the opportunity to write themselves, having never actually picked up a pen, but rather contributed to the narrative simply by engaging with its promotional artwork? The downward spiral design and warm color palette in No One Can Hear You takes inspiration from Vertigo as well. And the typography, composition, and collage elements of A Glitch is a Glitch seems to be inspired by Bass's poster for Anatomy of a Murder, where the anatomy of the figure is deconstructed, as well as the layout of the one sheet itself, which features this similarly tattered and divided midline. As the title suggests, BMO Noire is inspired by the film noir genre and mid-20th century poster design. Many posters in this era used a coarse, jagged type like the one seen in the title card, and these posters typically featured a female and male lead character in a dramatic pose staring into the middle distance, accentuating their facial expressions through dynamic lighting and shadow, and emphasize selling the audience on atmosphere, mystique, and star power, as opposed to the story itself. Compositionally, the BMO Noire title card looks very similar to the advert for the 1946 film The Dark Corner. And a particular motif that arose from this genre was the lead character encircled in light, and that was very much a sentiment of these films and their advertisements, that it's the A-lister that will attract the audience to watch the film, so they rightfully belong in the proverbial and literal spotlight. As a result, these posters also featured a lot of shadow and character silhouettes, establishing a darker tone immersed in secrecy, scandal, and violence, that these characters were constantly on the verge of finding something or being found out themselves. The title card for Root Beer Guy follows one of the more popular film noir poster templates, the floating heads design where the main characters are depicted from the torso or neck up. typically framed in circles, squares, or ovals, and a smaller snapshot of 2 or 3 characters engaging in some sort of action, oftentimes an aggressive confrontation. This collective creates a collage aesthetic that reminds you more of a graphic novel or a crime magazine than a movie poster. It reads very similarly to how you would traverse the panels of a comic book page, and personally reminds me of one of the most innovative cartoonists of all time when it comes to exploring fresh ways to communicate a two-dimensional narrative, Bill Watterson and his comic strip Calvin and Hobbes. The ingenuity of Calvin and Hobbes is that in some cases, you don't even have to engage with the comic sequentially or chronologically for it to make sense. You could explore the world and jump from panel to panel, discovering a new element of the story with every pass. And in that way, Watterson's comics were more comparable to a painting in a museum gallery than a Sunday strip in the funny pages. He did more to legitimize the comic strip or cartoon as a genuine art form than a majority of artists. This Sunday strip for Calvin and Hobbes isn't the most dynamic compared to Watterson's other works, but it does one of the better jobs at showcasing how color and framing can create a scene. In the bottom third of the page, Watterson creatively and subtly displays a pause from the action by changing the framing from an ordinary white square to a gray circle. It pops so much that if we were to zoom out, your eye would almost instinctually go to that part of the page. Inside the circle, we see a contemplative Calvin with furrowed eyebrows and a muffled expression. In this moment, we don't need any dialogue to know exactly what the character is thinking, because the gray backdrop in which he's surrounded speaks on his behalf in muted whispers of dullness and stagnancy. The choice in color highlights the emotions of Calvin, and a cyclic frame envelops this character and corrals us in that space until we absorb their emotions for ourselves. If we go back to the title card, we can see how the backsplash of color is used to reinforce the character's facial expressions and body language, and insist that we linger in that bubble long enough not only to witness, but assimilate with the slate blue melancholy of cherry cream soda and the yellowish green disgust of Princess Bubblegum. Root Beer Guy was a title card that I initially glossed over, but the closer I looked at it, it ended up being one of my favorites across the entire series, and a masterclass in color theory and composition. Speaking of cherry cream soda, this style gets reprised in the title card for Season 7's 3rd episode, bearing her namesake. The font in the title card for Rattleballs is reminiscent of classic westerns. We also see that the main character is standing at the edge of a cliff, staring beyond the valley and into the distant mountain range. This is an image that is very representative of Ruckenfigur, a German word meaning back figure, which is a motif that was popularized in the 19th century through the German Romanticism art movement, championed through the paintings of Caspar David Friedrich, in which an individual typically stands in the foreground with their backs positioned toward the audience, observing the landscape beyond them. Ruckenfigur allows the audience to identify with those featured in the painting, inviting them to fully inhabit the character and see the painting not from their own perspective, but the environment through the character's perspective. It's what takes place, for instance, in Andrew Wyeth's painting Christina's World, where we are invited not only to look into Christina's world, but welcomed to view it from Christina's POV.
I don't think I have an instinct to paint people with ugly ideas. I enjoyed humor and good-natured sort of subjects, and for some reason or other, I just painted the way I would like life to be,
One of the greatest painters to come from the United States, Norman Rockwell, was a massive proponent of Ruckenfigur and utilized it several times over the course of his career as a device to transport the audience into the worlds he portrayed, truly allowing the viewer to become one with what they were viewing, and allowing people not only to experience, say, the universal happiness of coming home, but the particular happiness a traveling businessman would experience walking into a family Christmas party, or a Marine returning from boot camp, or the topsy-turvy butterflies a young person might feel when watching the sunset with their first love. You get the opportunity to occupy these characters and even experience unanimous emotions like melancholy, anxiety, and awestruck wonder in ways that feel familiar and new all at once. In Ruckenfigur designs, we don't have a name or face to put with the character, but we do have body language and the emotions and visceral feelings those characters elicit. This is why you can see posters for action films, thrillers, and sports movies showcase a main character in the Ruckenfigur motif, commemorating them for their confidence, strength, control, and authority. Maybe the best use of Ruckenfigur in poster design comes from the Japanese poster for the spaghetti western for a few dollars more, and coincidentally matches closely to the Rattleball's title card, both characters dressed in windswept cloaks, standing in a warm color palette in a very heroic pose with a weapon drawn, very strongly communicating their resoluteness amongst their environment. The name for Season 7's episode Angel Face is based on the 1952 film, and here we have another font choice that is very reminiscent of 60s Western films and television. And in the foreground we can see BMO with a cowboy hat and Colt 45 saddled atop a rearing horse, an icon that we can also see in posters for films like The Sign of Zorro and Lawless Riders. Finally, Finn, aka Jackrabbit Johnson, stands in the background with an expression that bears a striking resemblance to Clint Eastwood in the poster for the outlawed Josie Wales. In the title card for Season 6, Episode 10, we see characters like Finn, Jake, and Princess Bubblegum highlighted in these dueling pyramids, and Darren's head in the background from an upward angle, forming this triangular layout. And this is not a coincidence. This title card was heavily inspired by the work of American illustrator and designer Drew Struzan. If you don't know him, you know his work. He's the genius behind some of the most classic and revered movie posters of all time. Though the floating heads concept had been around since the 1930s, Struzan's designs pioneered the way for the contemporary superhero movie poster and became the foundational blueprint for how to promote the franchise film or the ensemble cast. While the posters themselves remained rectangular, the triangle became the predominant shape to stylize the blockbuster because it was space efficient. It stabilized the viewer's eye line and improved the poster's readability, as well as naturally established a character hierarchy, in that way also becoming an effective method to develop a narrative before you ever saw the movie. In these formats, main characters are typically larger and at the top of the pyramid, or featured most prominently in the foreground, while secondary and minor characters sink into the background while descending and decreasing in size. An effective ensemble movie poster will read like a music festival lineup. The big names will be featured prominently and boldly at the top of the page, and with every subsequent line, the bands and performers will shrink in stature. In the same way, the floating head is proportional to either the character's significance to the film's plot or the character's overall marketability. Something that's interesting to note here as well is that, while many of these posters adhere to the traditional framing of good versus evil, that is, the protagonist front and center while the antagonist looms in the background, Struzan and others developed a revolutionary notion of storytelling through their art. Suddenly, the villain was no longer exclusive to lurking in the shadows. Instead, they became a part of the ensemble, an active participant in the narrative. The bad guy is no longer just a story structure through which the main characters traverse to grow or to achieve their goals, but is a three-dimensional character that we will have the opportunity to meet in some intimate, intentional way. What is declared through these posters is that the villain too has goals and reasons to achieve them, and that there will be growth to be had for them as well, whether positive or negative. Maybe they'll end up redeemed in some way, or maybe they'll end up even winning. In some ways, they are showcased as being equally as important. In other cases, the villain may be even more important than the heroes. Though there are still plenty of interesting contemporary designs produced in this style, it certainly seems to have oversaturated the market with several poor examples of movie posters.
I have to translate a three-dimensional person into a two-dimensional object, and photography doesn't always do that well. It reflects, exactly what you see, but artists hopefully are not just drawing what they see, but what they understand.
There's been a noticeable shift from the past, where designers like Struzan took a level of pride and craftsmanship in their hand-drawn artisanal work. But now, it simply appears to be a rubric where you copy and paste a bunch of photographs and slap a title on it and call it a poster. It's the difference, for example, between one of the greatest posters ever made, Blade Runner, and one of the worst posters ever made, Blade Runner 2049. That being said, the title card for Something Big is a great example of negative space, lighting, and perspective, utilizing a very colorful design and abstract composition. This title card is more of a return to form in my opinion, and stands out amongst the gray of the modern-day studio movie poster landscape. Here in the title card for Blank-Eyed Girl, we have this really great example of the usages of negative space as well as color and shadow, and in those ways really encapsulating the look and the vibe of contemporary movie poster design. We have this young girl with her eyes shrouded in darkness, backlit with this very harsh blue lighting, standing in the door frame of this cabin-looking house and having her shadow dragged out across the wooden floor, communicating this impending sort of looming threat with this very bleak, bright, contrasting font to the left of it. Perhaps the 70s horror movie posters like The Exorcist and Eraserhead, as well as Stephen King book covers, inspired the modern approach to horror typeface, stepping away from blocky, bold, expressive fonts of the mid-20th century for a more stripped-back, simpler font. This bare-bones approach in type alongside the cold, desaturated color scheme gives this card this chilling atmosphere, and this blueprint has dominated the commercialized horror landscape of the 2010s and beyond. However, we are seeing a resurgence of older design techniques in terms of perspective, negative space, font type, and color through the independent horror posters of the past few years. We also see a similar trend take place within science fiction. A lot of posters in the genre, in particular films from the 1990s, elected to use this hairline, elongated typography, as a lot of the films that utilized this style dealt with subjects like aliens, abductions, and artificial intelligence, where the worlds are cyberpunk or dystopian or futuristic. The typography is so sharp and precise, it could either mimic the wiry nature of the robotic exoskeleton in Elysium or the DNA strands in Gattaca, or give you shortness of breath in a space devoid of oxygen in posters like Dark Star or The Martian. Whatever the case may be, it's the kind of typography that communicates that the world we are entering accommodates for very few mistakes. Other ways the title card for the pods accurately represents the sci-fi genre is through its contrasting color scheme of darks and lights, in particular the color black paired with a neon green, and how lighting illuminates this contrast, that the subject emits this unnatural or otherworldly presence that is not homogeneous with the environment. The least common denominator amongst the sci-fi and horror genres is their utilization of negative space. In that way, their posters, in which the villain or victim faces toward you, act almost as the antithesis to the Ruckenfigur motif, in which the hero faces away from you. This convinces the audience to identify less with the subject and more so with the environment, and those environments are typically bleak, lonely, dark, and empty, and in all of those ways establishing an atmosphere of fear, and the longer we engage with it, the more we're sort of enveloped by it and become a part of it. What Ruckenfigur and the horror poster have in common is that they are both foundationally concerned with exploration, and if Ruckenfigur is the subject exploring this eternal expanse with their gaze going on forever, the subject in a horror poster is exploring their environment and their gaze stops at you. And there's a sort of dread and anxiety in that space where you have to come to terms with the fact that this thing that scares me, I'm going to have to interact with it at some point. And that interaction, whether sooner or later, is nonetheless inevitable. That this thing is approaching, and not only is something going to happen, but I have this feeling that it's going to happen to me specifically. Whereas in Ruckenfigur, the subject explores what's beyond themselves, an effective horror poster will actually explore you, and oftentimes that can end up becoming the most terrifying thing, maybe even more terrifying than the external threat itself. I just think it's incredibly interesting that we have these motifs in art that elicit specific emotions, and if a subject is pointed away from us, it actually can end up being a positive thing and convey a sort of heroism and gallantry of something that we should aspire to be like. But if that same subject is pointed toward us, it can end up being a very uncomfortable and uneasy feeling. It's actually the subject's desire to be intimate with us in whatever capacity that causes emotional harm rather than emotional healing. And that inherently is the power of the horror genre, and in my opinion, the genius of storytelling within the graphic design of science fiction and horror posters. And in my opinion, one of the most creative uses of negative space across all of Adventure Time's title cards comes in Season 8's episode titled Don't Look. It's very similar in composition to Season 4, Episode 25's I Remember You, and at first it appears as nothing more than Finn holding a pair of glasses, staring at himself in a mirror. But the farther you zoom out, the stronger the light in the center contrasts with the darkness surrounding it, and this contrast ends up defining the edges of an image that looks like a skull. An inverse of this actually occurs in the poster for the film Silence of the Lambs, where the moth over Jodie Foster's character's mouth appears to have a skull on its back. But if you zoom in closer, you can see that this is not a skull at all, but in reality, a group of models posing together. Hey everyone, that was part 2 to this Adventure Time title card series. Thank you so much for checking out Filmthetics. I hope that you found this episode engaging and entertaining and hopefully a little bit educational as well. I want to say thank you to everyone that engaged with part 1 to this video series. Specifically, thank you so much to everyone that commented in the comment section on that video. Every single one of your comments was filled with very kind words, very constructive feedback, and I just can't tell you how much I appreciate you guys and your response to something like this. There was one comment in particular that really blew me away, and it was such an answer to something that was really hopeful heading into the series, which was, I hope that there's at least one person out there that engages with this channel that learns something new about art or about movies that gets them excited, not just about engaging with art that's already been created, but also on a deeper level, gets them excited about creating that art themselves. And there was one comment in particular that highlighted something along the lines of, now I know that I'm a fan of diegetic typography. That was such a cool thing to hear from someone that gets excited about stuff like this and excited about getting other people excited about art. I'm just really grateful for a comment like that. I originally anticipated this to just be a 2-part series, but the more research that I did, I found that there were like some other pockets of connective tissue between graphic design and movie posters and the Adventure Time title cards. They were just like one-off examples that didn't fit quite into categories like Western genre or film noir or horror or anything like that. So let me know in the comments if you'd be interested in seeing a part 3. It'd probably be like half the length of episodes 1 and 2, but there's just some other little examples out there that I think are interesting. So if you're interested in seeing something like that, let me know and I can put that together. But in the meantime, I'm working on a bunch of other episodes, doing some more research on stuff that I personally am pretty excited about sharing with you guys, and I hope to see you in the next one. Yeah, all right. Take care, guys. Have a nice day.